Oh, it does work. Welcome to EU Development Days. Discussion of the value of culture and creativity in an urban environment. Urban. Why would we talk about urban when we're talking about the developing world? We need to talk about rural areas. It's because development is going to be very important in developing the cities, where 80% of the population of the developing world is going to be living within about a generation. By 2030, we're going to have 2 billion more people living in cities in the developing world. What are we going to do about that? Think of a scenario where it does not work, where there is development, but it is not in the way that responds to people coming from rural areas. Could we have alienation? Could we lack a social fabric, lack social cohesion? Could there be instability? How do we address this, thinking about what we're going to do post-2015? How are we going to make those post-2015 goals perhaps be more achievable than the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals we have now? Let's see if we can make that work, and that's what this discussion is about today. And we have a panel of 5 people, including 2 urban planners, a former mayor, a community arts director, and a member of the business community. And all those kinds of people are going to have to be working together to make this work and to come up with solutions. And we hope to find some solutions today. And this is why the European Commission, the European Union, and the UN, as well as Beaux-Arts, which is the flagship cultural center of Brussels, have come together to discuss this. How do you integrate culture in urban development? Very big question. Should we? Is it too expensive? Will it be chaotic? Is it unfeasible? Let's talk about it. And to start to talk about it is, let's go first to Luis Riera Figueras. He's the Director of Human and Society Development at Europe Aid, DG Development and Cooperation at the European Commission. Mr. Figueras.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I will be extremely short because I have to preside another panel in 5 minutes. But when I got to know that you were having this meeting, I asked really to be in the panel. Because it's an issue that it's very close to my, I wouldn't say to my heart, but to my rationale about what development should be. Because I think that in a way, in the development policy world, we somehow not input sufficiently in our thinking the territorial impact of what we are doing. And I think that this is a key element if we want to get real value for our actions, is to contemplate more in depth the relations and the territorial impact that we are having when entering into any political strategy in development. So in this sense, I think that the marrying of urban considerations and development aspects is extremely important, because I think that through cities, it's the way to ensure that our development has a strong social dimension and it's sustainable in the future. I mean, we all know about how important, and we all have been in traffic jams in Nairobi, in Lagos, and in any other country, in any other capital. And I think that we should, while ensuring that the cities and the major agglomerations functions as a vector of growth, they function also, and this is the major topic, as a base to ensure social growth and social well-being for the citizens living there. So I couldn't applaud more this initiative. We are extremely happy to be in this endeavor with Beaux-Arts, and I would like to express how happy I am to be with Paul again in this area. And we are, of course, very happy to be working with UN Habitat and with UNESCO in this area. Again, we think that we have a lot to gain to inputting more territorial analysis in our development policies. And of course, I mean, it's not, we shouldn't oppose rural versus urban, because at the end of the day, it's all part of the territory, and we should make sure that through our development policies, we create synergies between the two dimensions. So thank you very much. The Commission is well represented in this meeting, so the fact that I have to leave, don't take it as a lack of interest from the Commission, rather the opposite. I am here because of my personal interest and the Commission's interest in this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. Let me ask you one question. I read something you wrote a few years ago, and you said culture has been a hidden component of development policy, a hidden component. In 10 seconds, how do you get it out from being hidden? How do you bring it out?
I think it's a task which is a challenging task for all of us, no? And I think that actually it's not about mainstreaming culture. It's about ensuring that an appropriate input of the cultural environment we are working in is a prerequisite for being successful. And I think that inputting this, we shouldn't make it visible, because if we keep it hidden, we will forget key components which at the end will determine the failure or the success. And that's why we have to bring it up.
That's why we're talking about it today. Yeah. Exactly. Okay. Thank you, Luis. Thank you very much. Thank you. Let's call up Paul Dujardin, who is the CEO of Beaux-Arts, the Center for Fine Arts here in Brussels. He's the founder of Ars Musica, Contemporary Music Festival. He's a former head of the Brussels Philharmonic Society. He initiated the Visionary Africa Festival in 2010, and that's what's very important, is that's part of this effort to try to make culture as part of urban planning. Mr. Dujardin, thank you.
So thank you for this platform, and with my team, some of the members of the team, Kathleen Lau and Anna Vondracek. It's true, Beaux-Arts in a certain way no experience with these matters, but I remember in 2008, Belgium has a very special relationship with Africa, and more specifically with Congo. So it was a challenge for an European art center to do something with this material in 2010. And instead to do a bilateral Belgo-Congo project, we thought it was much more interesting to work on the 23 countries who had to fight their independence. So it became, in our opinion, an European-African project. And as you know, the most important institution for science and cultural heritage of Africa's continent on the globe is in Brussels, at Tervuren, the Versailles of Belgium. So for those who don't know, in the coming days it will be closing for 5 years. And I think if you never had seen it, you need to go tomorrow morning to take the tram 44, because it's a historical place on the approach of colonialism. It's fundamental, certainly on not the urban planning, but on another side of view of this global continent, and very impressive institution. We will help And we will try with all modesty to work on a concept of the move of a colonial museum to bring it to the contemporary reality in an Africa and a Europe where migration in Europe, having 25 million Europeans coming from that continent. So the dialogue is fundamental in the regional policy of the Mediterranean world. So, and it was in that reason that we started with this Visionary Africa project. We had the honor with the team of the Commission to present this project during the Africa Summit in Tripoli in 2010, 3 months for the Arab Spring. Was an impressive way that we could present there. And so it was presented from Cairo to Harare. Not always easy. I remember all the problems we had in Ethiopia. It was to involve cultural heritage and at the same time young artists. So I remember in a discussion even recently our Ethiopian friends who were involved were still not so happy with what happened. So it's still challenging how to make and to work together with these communities. So I'm happy that finally Inhabitants and Beaux-Arts as a very small player between the Commission and the UN to be involved in this project. And I will be very short here. And I would like to quote the Cameroon writer, Achille Mbembe, who said, in circumstances where millions of people struggle to make it from today to tomorrow, the work of culture is to pave the way for a certain practice of the imagination, without which people have a name and a voice. End of the quote. And the question to all of us is, if cultures in cities cost too much, is indifference in urban no man's lands sustainable? That's really a question, and I hope that during this debate we will come to a certain number of answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Dujardin. Thank you. We will also have comment from Thomas Mellin of UN Habitat. Thomas, perhaps you could just present yourself. But he's going to speak later. He and I are going to sum up the conversation, maybe come up with some answers to this question. And in the meantime, before we get to that, and before we get to our panel, I'd like to show you a video. And this video is of an art festival, a continuous art festival called Naini Hu, which is slang for Who is Nairobi. And this shows you a bit of how cultural activity can be integrated into the city. It's an example of that. There are lots of videos of it, so we picked this one. We thought it was rather lively, just to sort of give you an idea of what's going on the ground in Africa. Let's see the video.
Nairobi. Naini mimi na wewe, naini sisi wote. Naini hu, naini nani, tulempa na celebrate. Naini hu, shengekia. Naini nani, naini na celebrate. Naini hu, shengekia. Naini ni mimi na wewe. Hasla, hauyuko kwenye payslip tunasaka. Michoro zina link magizani bila slip. Nasaka job, nataka job, mimi safara. Peleka CD wape sweet in the office. Kubali mteja yule, mbaya, yule mbaya. Soge naini nani ni mita zote Nairobi. Karibu naini huu, hata wewe ni soko. Kidai any service ni available. Soma lebo naini huu, umechorwa, umetoka ocha. Okay, I'm a typical bona in, bona in, bona in. What do you do for a living? I'm feeding hope, not stealing, killing. Where? In a pen, I'm hoping. Missy terrible and party naughty. Yeah. Any mama mboga, hawezi lala njaa kuna mboga. Tunapenda mjengo, tukijenga Nairobi yetu. Tunapenda mziki, manze tunapenda mziki. Hustle, umehaso, unafaa kula jasho yako.
And someone who can help to explain a bit of that is Joy Maboya. Hello, Joy. It's one of the panelists. Joy was one of those, actually you spearheaded that Nainihu. Joy is director of Nairobi's Go Down Arts Center. And next to Joy is Carlos Jamarillo, who is an architect, former director of planning of the city of Medellin in Colombia. Matilda Gustafson, Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility Director of Ericsson, which you're all familiar with. Mayor, Mr. Mayor Muchadei Ashton Masunda of Harare, former mayor of Harare. And Shipra Narang Suri, who is Vice President of the International Society of City and Regional Planners. Let's start with Shipra in making a, sort of describing what you have done up to now in addressing this issue. And let's try to get from all these different aspects, these different angles of the issue, if we can put all that together. And what we'll do after the presentations is we're going to pitch a couple of questions to you that you could vote on after hearing what they have to say. Maybe you might change your mind. Shipra.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm very honored to be invited to this gathering and to this panel. So why are we here, and what are we talking about? Well, to paraphrase a well-known saying or a well-known quote, man does not live by bread alone. He also needs culture. He needs food for the soul, which is provided by art, by culture in its various manifestations, by performing arts, by visual arts, architecture, drama, theater, literature, poetry, etc. The question I want to explore is culture and creativity only found in these formal art forms? Is that all we are talking about when we're talking about cities? How can creativity in its widest sense be harnessed to make cities more sustainable, more livable, more inclusive over time? This is what I'm going to focus on. You just saw a video of Nairobi, but and that's a typical example of any developing country city in many ways. Let's zoom out a little and look at the big picture, the larger facts of urbanization, and Chris already spoke about some of them. Over 3.5 billion people living in cities. And as you can see probably in that graph, by 2050, Africa will have an urban population of 1.25 billion, Asia 3.25 billion, and you put those together and compare it with the rest of the world, including North America, including Europe, including everywhere else, 1.75 billion in all. That's a lot of people in developing country cities. And you can see the exponential growth projected for Africa in between 2050 and the year 2100. The fastest growing city in the world at this point in time, up to 2020, is, any guesses? It's Kinshasa. If you can imagine. It's Kinshasa, which is expected to grow by 46% between 2010 and 2020. And many of these cities, like Kinshasa, are completely ill-equipped to cope with the challenges of urbanization. We all agree that urbanization brings a lot of benefits to cities and to the regions where cities sit and to countries and to sort of supranational regions as we've seen in Europe. But urbanization also brings with it several problems and several challenges. The challenges of poverty, the challenges of slums, the challenges of inequality, urban sprawl, energy consumption, greenhouse gases, climate change, you name it, and cities are at the center of it.
So how do you get culture to address those issues?
Coming to it.
Okay.
Well, the point I'm making is that urbanization can lead to either a fragmented process, a fragmented city, which is exclusionary, which is fragmented socially, spatially, economically, or it can help in building an inclusive city. And a very important component of building an inclusive city is public space. Public spaces, and I'll talk about culture and the role of culture in building good public spaces, are extremely important. Well-connected, interconnected, well-developed, creatively designed public spaces can actually help They can be the spine of a city, they can give shape and form to a city, they can help in several ways in a sustainable urbanization process. Two major ways. First of all, public spaces define the quality of life in a city. All of us, we all live in cities. When you look at a city, you look at its squares, its plazas, its mass rapid transit system, its waterways, its markets, and any city which can develop those elements will actually always be rated quite highly on the livability scale. But the second dimension of public space and the second role of public space, which is less obvious, is that of building social cohesion. And again, culture comes into that, and I will talk about it.
As we saw in the video, have
Yes.
spaces so people can do that. Right?
And part of social cohesion, everybody talks of social cohesion and in different ways, and their understanding of social cohesion is different, which is also a question we've posed online, I think. Have you posted those questions?
We will.
We will. So everybody understands social cohesion differently. Some people talk about incomes equality. Some people talk about access to opportunities. But a very important part of social cohesion is belongingness, which in turn is reinforced by values such as multiculturalism, by trust, by participation. And again, these can be reinforced, strengthened, reinforced, or undermined by the quality, by public spaces which are developed in cities. How can this be done? Very quickly, two examples. One from a developed country city and one from a developing country city, very different, on how they have used public spaces creatively to start engaging populations and to make development more responsive. The first example comes from Warwick Junction in Durban in South Africa. This place is a very heavily trafficked transport interchange. About 500,000 commuters go through it every day. And about 6,000 to 8,000 street vendors operate in it naturally, because it's a place where they do business. And they are engaged in a wide range of commercial activities. This area is almost 100 years old. They sell fresh produce, they sell traditional medicines, they sell arts and crafts and clothes and meat and all kinds of things all in one place. And in 1996, there was a process of urban renewal which was initiated here, very participatory, very engaged with all kinds of stakeholders, from the city hall to the street traders and to people who commute through that area. And it completely transformed that area. Changed the way it looked. It provided amenities to people. It created better looking, more designs, created more pedestrian space, made it really worth living and working and walking through that area.
We'll have to
And it
go
was done
quickly
in
to
a
the
culturally
mayor.
sensitive way.
Yeah, so if you could sum up pretty soon, and we can go to the mayor now.
Okay. Well, the second example, but I will not go into detail, is about bringing art and culture into a newly developing area. It's the south of Paris. And there, this community, it was opened up to students, artists, community people living in that area, and brought them into that neighborhood. So they start owning it, they start seeing how it's developed, and build a sense of pride. So there's different ways in which art and culture can be used and can be deployed in cities. Essentially, what we're saying is, in sum, a few caveats that I'd like to sum it up. First of all, creativity in cities need not be just overly just formal creativity in terms of art or overly flamboyant. Creative solutions to everyday problems and challenges, which allow for broad-based participation, are far more important, in my view, than the promotion of just formal art and culture. A selective focus on formal art and culture in certain specific areas of cities can also lead to elitism and gentrification, which is again not the type of city that we're looking for. And to bank solely on art and culture to revive a city is really, would be presumptuous, I think, and premature. Third, I'd like to say that we all count on art and architecture and planning as providing the values for multicultural and integrative cities. but they can also be divisive and provocative, as has been seen in several cities affected by conflict and divided by conflict. So how do you use them in a way that they're not divisive elements, but actually integrative elements? And
Very good.
finally, I think one man's art can be another one's mess or noise. And a classic example of that is street art or graffiti. Last month, the street artist Banksy said he was setting up residencies. He's very famous, actually, and he said he was taking up residency on the streets of New York. He's incredibly famous. People are fascinated by his work, but it was seen as, graffiti is typically seen as a sign of decay by city leaders and mayors, and the mayor of New York was not impressed. People were fascinated, but he was not impressed, and he sent out a hunt for Banksy. So there is a very fine line between art and different expressions of art.
But it's a matter of
So that's-
managing that, isn't it?
Yes, and
Managing
it is,
that, yeah.
it is a matter of
Yeah.
managing that, but it's also a matter of creating space for different expressions of art.
And getting the people involved so that they have a stake, so that they own it. Right,
Indeed.
good.
And
Okay.
I think I'd like to conclude by saying that we can't assume that a creative city will be an inclusive city. A creative city, as you just said, can be inclusionary or exclusionary. It's a matter of managing it. It's a matter of, it depends on who creates, who nurtures, and who accesses that creativity. In the race towards creating sort of very modern and profitable urban spaces, this human scale and this point of view is often lost, and this is where planners have a very important role to keep the focus on inclusion.
Very good, Shipra. Thank you very much. Shipra Narang Suri. Thank you. Let's go to the mayor of Harare, Muhadei Ashton Masunda. Please, the former mayor. He's also co-president of the UCLG, the United Cities and Local Governments Group. And he was
Right,
on
Mr.
UN
Mayor.
Habitat's Advisory Group on Gender Issues and its World Urban Forum.
Right.
Mr. Mayor.
Well, thank you. In the limited time that I have, I just want to walk you through some practical issues that I've had to deal with, especially in the last 5 years when I was mayor of Harare, which is a metropolis with 3 million people and 1.5 million people from the satellite towns. So you can imagine having to look after the practical day-to-day needs of 4.5 million people. So that was quite a sobering thing for me to do, especially given the background that I had, having been born and brought up in Bulawayo, which was one of the neatest and smartest cities, not just in Africa, but in the world. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the model that we had in Bulawayo was then replicated throughout not only Zimbabwe, but throughout Central and Southern Africa. And it was driven largely by Dr. Hugh Ashton, an Oxford-trained anthropologist, and it was predicated upon essentially 4 things: education, culture, arts, and sport. And so we got exposed to all those 5 things as we were kids, and what it did was it inculcated in all of us a sense of purpose and discipline, and it made it a lot easier, especially for a lot of refugees that were coming to Bulawayo following the railway line from the troubled Belgian Congo at the time. And through all those cultural and arts and educational programs, it was very easy to integrate a lot of these people that were coming into Bulawayo who were originally from outside. And that taught me an invaluable lesson in later life when I became mayor, that in a city, you've got to make sure that the city is inclusive. And you must adopt a bottoms-up approach and not impose solutions. And that's why I watched with chuckle that video from Nairobi, because we see a whole lot of things there. The injudicious use of space, if I may say so, Joy, you can correct me if you like, but a lot of the things that happen on the ground is through to lack of political will. Because if there's planning as there was in most of the cities in Zimbabwe, I'm sure most of you who have been to the bigger cities in Zimbabwe, you will agree with me that they're amongst the most well-planned especially Bulawayo, Harare, and so forth, because all the things that happen in Bulawayo were, as I said earlier, replicated throughout. You find that in each of these cities, you've got departments of urban planning services, Department of Engineering Services, Department of Housing and Community Services, and it is those departments that are actually seized with the responsibility of making sure that cultural, educational, sporting, and all those programs actually happen. So you'll find that, for instance, in Harare, we have 10 golf courses within a 25-kilometer radius. And it's not by accident that we have produced the Nick Prices of this world. And the tennis players like Byron Black and Wayne Black, and the list is endless. But it's all to do with the judicious management of space. And more recently, we've got some vivid examples of what can be achieved if space is used properly. We've got the Harare International Festival of the Arts, which is now almost on par with the Edinburgh Festival of Arts. And to see during that 1 week when Haifa is on, Harare being transformed into a truly cosmopolitan city, and you could be forgiven for asking, well, what is the problem? When you see the kind of verve and atmosphere that is engendered during that week of Haifa. But the last point I want to touch on is a question of cost. There is a cost to a lot of these things that need to be done in order to take the country, the cities forward. Because as the moderator mentioned right at the beginning, there is a relentless migration of people from rural areas to urban areas. And the critical question that we have to deal with, especially when you are in my shoes, as it were, is to how to cope with all that. Because in the case of Harare, for instance, we had more than adequate resources to cope with the numbers at independence in 1980, because we were looking at a population that was under 2 million. But those same infrastructural facilities are now expected to cater for the sort of numbers that I mentioned earlier. And there is a cost. And by the way, I'll tell you something that many of you may not believe. Virtually all the bigger cities in Zimbabwe fund their own activities with no input whatsoever from central government. And that takes a lot of discipline. It's because of all the discipline that was inculcated in all the people that were running the cities in the early 50s and right up to immediately after independence. So, for instance, in Harare, we had a very ambitious revenue and capital expenditure budget of just under 600 million. And our operations were the equivalent of 15 central government ministries. And I think it's that discipline that has to be seen to continue, and people to realize that for joy to achieve the kind of things that obviously need to be achieved, having watched that video clip, there's a cost to it. And people have to pay for all those things. So I'd like to leave it at that stage and say there is a critical role to be played by both the city planners, and because in the case of Harare, and I'm sure the same applies to other cities, there's a greater Harare plan, which has to be revisited from time to time to make sure that it is in sync with the Harare of today as opposed to Harare of 1980 or Harare of 1890 when the city was established. But let's bear in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that all these things that need to be done to make the cities livable, to make the cities inclusive, to make the cities cater for the motley mixture of people that gravitate towards the city in search of the proverbial pot of gold, because we all know that in cities, that's where most of the GDPs of various countries is generated. So we just need to make sure that we get our act together, consult widely with all the key players, the city planners, the medical specialists, the engineers, and everyone else, so that we make sure that we don't lose the plot and end up with slums. And I'm very pleased to say that with the support that we have received from, amongst others, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the city of Harare and other cities in Zimbabwe have become a model, for a number of cities in Africa. And I've done my best in the last 3 years when I was co-president of UCLG to make sure that we export that precedent to various other parts of the developing world. I'll be ready to take questions. I think that's all I want to say at this stage. Thank you.
I might point out, what you see on the screen here, SMS, web, and tweet, these are ways that you can get involved here, and also this is being streamed everywhere. So whoever's watching this streaming, you can also You'll probably see this somewhere on your screen too, where you can send in questions via SMS, via the web, via tweeting. Let's move on. Let's move on to Matilda Gustafsson. She is the Sustainability and Corporate Responsibility Director of Ericsson. Since 2009, she's focused on driving Ericsson's sustainability strategy for cities and to fight climate change. Matilda.
Thank you. So my name is Matilda Genve Gustafsson, working at Ericsson. Ericsson was founded in 1876 by Lars Magnus Ericsson and his wife Hilda. And at that time, what they envisioned was they wanted to build technology that could help people to communicate with each other. And what we see now is that new technologies are transforming the way individuals, business, and the public sector communicate and collaborate in an unprecedented scale. The emerging network society broadens the scope of cooperation, participation, and knowledge sharing, and enabling new innovative and creative ways of doing business and shaping the future. And in our research on the network society, we see a shift towards a culture that is more purpose-driven, collaborative, interest-centric, and we have put a young person here in the middle because we see it's really all these young people who have a very different way of being able to use technology and hence also collaborating. Cities around the world, they have a lot of different challenges that they face. Some are thematic that are the same around the world, like transportation or accessibility to low carbon energy. And some are very specific for different cities, depending upon the culture or demographic. However, what we see everywhere today is the rapid information and communication technology development is really impacting cities in a way that many cities don't really understand themselves. With the intelligent networks, it will be critical to have that in place for the basic functioning of our cities, to their success of meeting current and emerging challenges, but also to be attractive as cities. We know that in some studies that, for example, commuting is one of the most frustrating things in the world for everyday life. If commuting can be done in a better way with mobile broadband, where you can communicate with your family, where you can work, or where you can watch TV or TV programs, then commuting can be much more pleasant. And then that really reduces everyday frustration. And of course, also with information and communication technology, you can communicate in a much better way if you have information about different types of modes in the public transportation. But also the next step is to reduce the need of commuting with the help of information and communication technology. And one example there is where we see in cities where they have put up, like in Jakarta, they have put up Wi-Fi hotspots in public spaces. And one of the purposes with these public spaces Wi-Fis is that they want people to be able to work more on distance, to reduce congestions and time spent there.
Matilda, can that also be used on a cultural level, I guess, too? If you have Wi-Fi in public spaces, that probably makes things a lot easier to have cultural activity. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. So it's not only for the commuting, but it's also to transform the whole city and the collaboration in the city.
So what's in it for a company like you to get involved in this? Because this costs money, and local budgets can't always cover that. I'm sure the mayor will tell you that. I'm sure Joy will tell you that. So what's in it for you, companies like yourselves, to get involved and do this?
So coming into then the role of ICT, and here we see different types of role, where one is of course our own company. What do we do? And we have offices in 180 countries all over the world. And since the year 1900, less than 5% of the sales is in Sweden. So we're truly international. And we have a lot of the innovation capacity is really in different types of creative technology clusters around the world. And our headquarters is in Stockholm, and there we are in an IT cluster in a suburb called Kista. In Nairobi, for example, we're part of the iHub. So that's a technology cluster, which is really important for us. And then, of course, we're part of the California IT cluster. And then another example is in Moscow, where we're part of Skolkovo, a new IT cluster. But it's not enough for us to be in these IT clusters and the creative clusters. We also need to have something more to tell when we attract, because we want to have the top talents. And then when we describe where these IT clusters are, it's important for us as well to be able to describe the cities as vibrant cities, as interesting cities, as inclusive, and with vibrant, that they also have a compelling story about the future. And I know when I've been speaking to some people within Ericsson who are a bit, they don't really know what is the future of the city where they're living right now. So these concerns about the compelling future is so important. And then how you get a vibrant city with the help of culture is also some of the key elements that we see from the business sector.
Okay, say Joy has a project in Nairobi, and she needs private sector funding. And I'm another company, whatever other company, a global company or a local company, and can you persuade me as somebody in the private sector why I should get involved? Why should business get involved in a local cultural project, and also in planning that project, and planning that city?
So I was going to end now with some examples from around the world.
Okay,
Yeah.
briefly?
Yeah. And here, for example, one example is in Mexico, where there are community programs on how you're using ICT to help local communities in the poorest areas to build up web pages where they can share the products that they produce there that they can sell, what kind of festivals they have, what other activities and cultural activities that they have there to attract tourists. So that's one type of this co-creation that business can do together with communities, but in this case it was also the local government to help with some of the funding. Another one is the co-creation hub in Nigeria. It's a Lagos-based firm where people who have ideas on how you can address challenges, local challenges, then they can meet investors. And the investors can then help to support them, but also support with funding in projects that they think are good. And it's also a platform for different types of knowledges and people to discuss problems in a way that they can't do otherwise, and they wouldn't meet otherwise. So it's a virtual public space, which is really, really interesting. One other thing that I would like to share as well is what happens really with identity and social media. My parents, they usually got an experience of a person depending upon how timely they were, if they were good on coming on time and delivering on time. I have a teenager, and her way of understanding the youngsters, her friends, is how rapid they are in the social media context. It's not if they're on time when they're going to meet to a party, but it is how they correspond and how they respond on the social media. So it's a totally different way of building identity now than it has been. So that's also changing from a culture and identity perspective that I think is really, really interesting. So the final part here is that we want to underline that it is a really need for an urban leadership with a clear vision, a direction, and actionable steps, and I've made some examples here, to get a safe and inclusive and, very important, a vibrant city that is attractive for people to live in. Thank you.
Matilda Gustafsson, thank you very much. Thank you. Let's go to Joy Maboya, Director of Nairobi's Go Down Arts Center. which provides subsidized space for Kenyan artists, organizes public events like Naini Hu, which we saw the video of. And Joy can tell us how to do this on the ground. How does this work on the ground?
Thank you. 2 years ago, the Go Down Art Center, in partnership with an international architectural firm called White Architects from Sweden, embarked on a project to influence the transformation of the urban area around the Go Down and around the central railway station in Nairobi, which are quite close together in proximity. And the idea here was to try and create a sustainable urban precinct that conserved the unique cultural heritage of the area, but also that introduced new quality urban experiences brought about by careful urban design. And the slide that you're looking at now shows you that area. The pentagon that we're looking at is the area that 2 years ago we started looking at with White Architects. You can see that the area comprises markets, it comprises stadia, new and old, it comprises museums, a playhouse, a university, a golf course, an historic cemetery, an historic prison, and of course also present in that area is the Go Down Art Center itself, and new clubs and shopping areas. So the way that White and the Go Down approached this was through a series of workshops with residents, with businesses, with artists, with urban development professionals, with city officials, to try to understand what it was that people would wish to see in this area if it was to be developed. And one thing that kept popping up in these conversations and these discussions was the question of the relationship of residents to the city. This idea of whether they belonged to the city or not, whether they felt they had ownership of the city or not. There was an ambivalence, a sort of a mixed question around whether there was a Nairobian or not a Nairobian. So we took this question a lot further, and we started a project which is called Naini Hu. This is a project that we ran this year over 3 months, between May and August. It was a 3-month festival. Naini Hu is basically urban slang. Nai stands for Nairobi. Ni is a Kiswahili word, and Hu is an English word. So Naini Hu is who is Nairobi. What we did with this festival was to divide the city into 12 zones, and each of these zones comprised several neighborhoods. And the idea was that each week, a different zone or a different neighborhood would program activities that would be publicized in the print media, on radio, on social media, and to which the city residents would be invited to come and take part. What the Go Down Art Center did was to facilitate the formation of neighborhood programming teams who willingly devised the week-long program activities themselves. So they decided what it was that they wished to share and show in the week programming within their own neighborhood. So we asked them to create these programs, though, based on the assets in their neighborhood that they felt best represented the spirit of their neighborhood. And these assets could be people, it could be places, it could be experiences, it could be services, it could be cultural and historical aspects, basically anything that they felt best represented their neighborhood. So of course they all settled on a variety of things. There were concerts, there were sports and games, there were parades, there were community cleanups and tree planting in some areas, there was visits to markets. Some neighborhoods wanted conversations on issues, social issues within their neighborhoods. Some celebrated their eateries, their restaurants, and some had special assets like parks, the national park, or forests. But one very important thing that came up in all of this was really the availability of public space, and public space in that sense of open and accessible space for people, the short supply of that space for the population of Nairobi. The table that you're looking at is trying to illustrate that a number of those activities took place in privately owned spaces. And these were spaces owned by schools, by churches, shopping center car parks, private halls, art centers, and even the street, which I think one would assume is public, was also required permission for use. We had to apply to the city council to have permissions to parade in the streets and to have activities in the streets.
So, Joy, are you saying that you faced resistance by the local government and you just had to do it yourself?
Well, we didn't face resistance. Actually, they came on board and they participated.
They
gave
finally
us
realized there was value in it.
They gave us concessions, actually, to use the street. But the interesting thing was that you actually had to make an application to use the street. It wasn't automatic. So early on in the festival, Nairobians caught on to this question, Naini Hu, and they began to sort of develop a response for it. And the response was Naini Sisi, or Nairobi is us. And so actually we ended the festival on that note of Naini Sisi. We had local musicians writing songs about Nairobi and actually using the slogan Naini Sisi in their songs. I think some of the insights that came out of this for us was firstly the importance of collaborative efforts to try to shift perceptions or to shift behavior. I mean, to drive this festival, actually, many players were working together. Those communication teams that came together to develop the sort of advertising strategy and iconography, the billboards, the TV and radio media strategy. There was the city permissions, of course, the city came on board, permissions to use the streets, to distribute flyers. There was police that we required for security. There were the resident teams themselves that prepared and ran the festival program. There was also collaboration of spaces, of art spaces, to flesh out and fill out the program of Naini Hu. And of course, there were also local businesses and local institutions that took part. So this, for us, was an important aspect of what made this festival successful.
So empowerment is kind of an important aspect of that then, right? Local empowerment.
Absolutely. And in fact, that's the second thing then that we also noted, that a lot of goodwill came out of this project because people were allowed to be part of the processes and to influence the process themselves. So empowering them. So local teams were facilitated only for movement and for meeting. They were not paid anything. And in fact, a lot of local pro bono support came from the private sector and the media. And the sense was that if people were included, if people felt that they had a role to play in this question of Nairobi, then they brought in a lot of goodwill and a lot of support. But then the third thing was really beginning to look at questions or issues of urban development in lateral and alternative ways. You know, Nairobi is a city of 3 million plus people. Through Naini Hu and through that collaborative effort, particularly the communication, we were able to reach roughly 2/3 of the city population. That's about 2 million people. Through the social media, 10% of the city participated and engaged in conversations around the city. And then week to week, physically present in these festivals was between 5,000 and 8,000 people. So the strength of the community to look at things in new ways, in different ways, we felt was one way of beginning to gauge residents' perceptions of themselves and who Nairobi is.
I think
And
that's,
I'll stop there.
yes, that's a way to
Thank
avoid
you.
there from being alienation, right?
That's right. Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you. Our final speaker is Carlos Jaramillo. And when you think of Medellin, if you thought about that a few years ago, you thought about violence, drug violence, right? Even before Mexico became outrageous, it was Medellin. That has changed. It's called the transformation of Medellin. Carlos is going to talk about that.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. Major, Mr. Credis, and companions, ladies and gentlemen. How to harness the power of culture, comprehensive social interventions. Medellin is Colombia's second largest city with a population of 2.6 million. The city experienced, as Chris said, during the 80s and 90s, a period of terror due to the drug trafficking, social deterioration, and a culture of illegality. Medellin's homicide rate reached 380 per 100,000 population for 1991. Violent actors reached immense levels of power due mainly to historical weakness of the institutions and corrupt and negligent governments. As a result, we had despair, fear, and apathy in society, which, in a figurative sense, led people to lock themselves up at their homes. As described by Major Sergio Fajardo, we live in a society with deep social inequity. We have a big accumulated historical social doubt, and in our city we have violence and with deep roots. After a historical election for the City Hall Fajardo's political movement first established a simple set of 13 rules which ruled our actions. For example, the development of the city is a commitment between local government and all citizens, and the example of the authorities are the main teaching tools for civic transformation. The effective actions of this government team for two administrations, 2004 and 2011, with new management models and a decided work for education, culture, science, and technology, among others, created an environment of trust, achieving a cultural change that allowed Medellin to move from fear to hope. Social urbanism. The opposite of insecurity is not security, but coexistence. And coexistence is built with social, educational, and cultural projects. This was a phrase from Jorge Melguizo, former Secretary of Culture. Social urbanism is an expression that means comprehensive social actions on violent, poor, and low-quality urban environments. Behind these urban interventions and the good architecture, there were simultaneous social actions and cultural actions in those territories. Of the social urbanism, the most representative strategy is the integral urban projects, or PUIs, we call them, which, as described by Major Fajardo, means all instruments of development placed into a territory, a very defined place. The territories defined for these actions were always settlements with high levels of informality and high crime rates with low human development indexes. In the social area, some examples of the actions and programs were workshops with the community in their neighborhoods for the identification of their imaginaries for the projects, dialogue and peace agreements with illegal armed actors, a vital minimum of free water services, the construction of kindergartens where psychosocial care and food supplement for these children were offered, prevention of pregnancy for teenagers, and 54 popular sport clubs where around 480,000 people benefit from the access of these venues.
Carlos, so when we discussed last night, you talked about how you talked about schools just now. Schools, there was a climate of fear in that city. And how did you break down that climate of fear? You took the walls down around the schools.
Right.
That's pretty risky, isn't it?
Yes, that's exactly the point. I mean, there were so many actions, but first of all, I have to say that the first thing one has to do, I think, as a government, is to gain trust. I mean, there's no other way, and that's why I started talking about principles and transparency. There's always a very important example, which is to create new models of behavior. And you can bring down walls, but if people do not trust you, nothing will happen.
You also broke down those walls by having those workshops, getting people to decide,
absolutely,
or help decide how to develop the city.
And also something important, which is citizens' participation and participatory budgeting. The formulation of the two governmental plans, as well as the most important actions of these administrations, had a broad process of participation, fostering a sense of co-responsibility. Medellin's 16 urban communes and 6 rural districts have a local development plan formulated by their communities, in which they prioritize the investment for participatory budget according to their communal needs. For the term 2008 to 2011, 12,747 delegates assigned community investment for $56 million. Knowledge and culture. Medellin is the city in Colombia where investment in culture is the biggest. To provide knowledge and culture of high quality was one of the main goals of these two administrations. Between 30 and 40% of the municipal budget was allocated to education and culture. Among others, we can highlight of these efforts 30 new cultural facilities have been created or modernized during these years. Museums of the city today have free access to the public. We have scholarships for artistic creation. The network of juvenile music schools was strengthened. Book Feast redesigned and fortified. Always, public and private partnership has played a very important role in this transformation of Medellin. For the work of many organizations and community cultural projects that for years faced violence with peaceful and persistent resistance, recognition was made with funds support from the municipal government.
But how did you get these guys to put away their guns? How did you transform that city from a gun-related, violence-related city to what it is now?
Yes.
With culture.
I always answer that saying by the combination of those efforts. I mean, it's not one simple formula, it's the combination of those, well, comprehensive social actions. Mm-hmm. It's a mixture. But first of all, gaining respect, gaining confidence as a government.
By talking to them locally.
Yes,
Trickle
definitely.
Up. Right.
That's why these participation programs are so important. Knowledge and culture and public space. All of the public buildings and neighborhoods amenities provided public space to encourage citizens encounter. Libraries were not libraries, but library parks. Schools in the past, as you said, Chris, were surrounded by walls to prevent students from the danger of the streets. These walls were thrown down and public space was incorporated into the new buildings. Insecurity diminished. We built 21 new quality schools, more than 100 schools renovated, but schools as buildings, they were only a symbol. There was a huge effort behind education.
So how would you sum that up then? Because we've got to go to the questions now from the audience. How would you sum that up in just a couple of words? How did Medellin transform itself with what you did?
Well, definitely a combination of actions led by respect.
Perfect. Carlos, thank you very much. Carlos. So you heard it from the panel. Let's hear it from you. After you've heard what they had to say, let's shoot some questions at you. Can we do that now? Frédéric, can we put those on the screen? We have two questions. How big a role should artists and cultural organizations play in urban planning? A deciding role? Oh, back up. A deciding role? An influential role or a consultative role? Should we just listen to them, or should they have a seat at the table? Okay, next. In one word, what best promotes social cohesion in a city? In one word. And you can send that via SMS, the number there, 33 6 33 13 40 34. You can also go via app Y-Assembly. You see all the details there. We'd also like to hear your questions from the audience and also online. There's a hashtag, which is hashtag, if I'm correct now, hashtag EUDD13 underline P as in Paul 2015. P 2015 because we're looking for post 2015. What are we going to do after these Millennium Development Goals run out? And we're probably not going to meet them all. So what are we going to do for the next plan? And how are we going to get culture involved in that? Or should we? Why don't we start with a question from the audience? And there is someone in the audience who I'm curious in knowing what she has to say. Charlotte Morantin, ACP Interactive Q&A. ACP Interactive, right? Right. Can we get a microphone over to Charlotte? And we'd like to hear from many of you as well. So, Charlotte.
Yeah, so ACP Culture Plus program is a program aiming to structure the ACP cultural sector. And I was wondering, thank you for all your interesting contributions. So I was wondering what would be the main and principal recommendations you would make to policy and decision makers for an optimal integration of culture and creativity as vectors for urban and socio-political development in future urban policies in ACP regions, but also on an international, a more international level.
Who would like to take that first? Huh? Mayor?
Can I just explain, maybe in partial answer to your question and a question that was put on the board there. We, for instance, raised a lot of money, by thinking outside the box. And in the course of providing these amenities for members of the community, we created beer halls, for instance, which provided a setting for men to meet. But in the course of providing those amenities, we brewed opaque beer, African beer, and sold it to generate profits, which were plowed back into the community to provide all those essential services that are needed. Because like I explained earlier, the local authorities funded all their projects. So all that money that was generated from the sale of opaque beer went into providing not only the facilities for artists, but for young girls and young boys, to be taken through a whole variety of things, and also to create art centers and libraries and museums, and so that the artists can have a medium through which they can make a contribution towards the overall planning, because all these things cannot happen in a vacuum. I mean, most artists and cultural operators are dreamers. It's a question of harnessing their dreams and turning them into reality. Because if they're allowed to dream, then those dreams become difficult to actually translate into reality and make them work.
Shifra, how realistic is it to integrate culture in that?
I think
in the planning.
I think it's very important. I think it's very realistic, but there are several ways in which I think you can do it. First of all, respect local culture and harness local creativity for addressing everyday urban problems. That's very, very important. Second, as I said before, make space for different expressions of creativity and different that come from different people. The third, very important, is make art and culture accessible to people. It's not just about galleries and museums. It should be out there. Every citizen, every person, young, old, school-going, senior, should be able to live with it and access it. And finally, I think with that, we need to build an appreciation of art and culture. And that goes beyond the remit of some of us sitting here. But really, that should be built into the education system, because I think we're losing that in our formal education system, appreciation of the arts, of literature, of music, of society in general, which makes us more tolerant as a society and more cohesive. So all of those things, I think, can help in integrating it into urban development.
Matilda.
Yes, so from the business sector, one way of engaging with the business sector could be, for example, many businesses, they have different type of employee engagement programs where employees have for one day a year or several days a year where they can do community work. And one way, for example, from the ICT sector, they can be there and help artists to get out in other spaces so that they can reach out to the community in different ways, or also to be able to sell the arts that they have in a different way, to find other channels and also other ways of just sharing what they're doing and collaborating in virtual spaces as well. And then also having businesses to provide with technology, not only money, not only that sponsoring in that way, but also with the latest technology, and also understanding how you can use the latest technologies.
Joy, you and I, last night we talked about virtual settlements, I think you would call that, informal settlements.
Yes.
Informal settlements. I mean, how do you deal with that? This is not planning, it's a fait accompli. You have people who suddenly settled there. And how do you work that into the plan?
I think one of the things that we learned from the festival that we did, and this happened also in the informal settlements, is that those spaces do have a sense of planning from the residents themselves. The fact is that they're illegal, and therefore they cannot settle themselves as firmly as they would wish to be. But just in one particular neighborhood where we had the festival, we asked the community to devise a walking tour where members from other parts of the city, if they came to the community, would be able to understand how that particular neighborhood worked. What surprised me and actually impressed me around this particular walking tour is that there was actually structure and logic around that tour. We went through a space that was a market. They carved out a space for a market. We went through an area where they deliberately put in a school, an informal settlement school. Then there was a big sort of cavernous area which they said, this is where we have films. This is a public space for us. And then under a billboard was a stranger space, much tinier than this, perhaps a quarter of this. And I said, if we bring a concert to this space, where would you put the musicians? And they said, this is the space for the musicians, under this public billboard. So there is a sense of space, public and private, in those areas that exist. And for me, I wonder why planners do not look at this and to begin to understand how people are beginning to sort of create space for themselves and to enhance that. Of course, they're not the experts, but to enhance that.
So Carlos, isn't that like a nightmare for a city planner like you? You know, spontaneous settlements. What are you going to do with that?
No. It's fantastic. Chipra said different spaces for different expressions. No, it's fantastic. I think that's the sense of the city, to provide those different spaces. I mean, everywhere.
And you consult the groups that are there for your plan. I mean, Mayor, what do you think?
It gets back. I think at the end of the day,
Give him some sound.
It boils down to discipline, you know, and unfortunately, when you start having vending being conducted in an indiscriminate manner, you know, those poor folk who are doing the vending become prey or vulnerable to the politicians, especially in the build-up towards an election. I mean, I saw vending being done in a disciplined manner in Mexico, where on a Saturday afternoon from about lunchtime until 4 o'clock, you know, the entire CBD of Mexico City gets turned into marketing stalls. And it's done in such a disciplined manner that by 4 o'clock on Sunday, everybody has taken down their stalls and away they go. So we tried it in Harare, and it worked up to a certain time, but it all broke down, and I was forced to review the position and restore order. Because whatever it is that needs to be done, it has to be done in accordance with that plan, and there's nothing to stop any interested stakeholder from making submissions so that their interests are factored into the equation, and that Greater Harare plan or Bulawayo plan gets reviewed and changed to meet the needs of the various interested stakeholders. I'm definitely against indiscriminate vending.
Do we have any other questions out here? Yes, sir. Please. Identify yourself, please.
Yes. Okay, my name is Ewart. I'm just someone who's interested in various expressions in art. I heard you talk about street art, so I was wondering, how do you guys look to people who use not really the well-liked and well-received forms of expression like street art or illegal forms of art, people who just take up public space to organize festivals, parties, yeah, just do their own thing without asking permission? Because we've seen like a lot of people going in the repressive reaction, just shutting the whole thing down. Some cities or businesses want to use these people to help them. Some people just let everything go their own way.
Yeah, so the next Jean-Michel Basquiat, the next Banksy, what are you going to do with that person? Are you going to repress them, or are you going to put them at the table and plan your city? Shipra.
As I said, I think there's a fine line. Street art, graffiti, particularly that kind of thing, there's a fine line between what you call street art and what you call defacing the city and ruining public property. So there's a fine line, and every city is different. Very often what happens is that if a street artist starts to become famous and popular, then the government co-opts them into the process and starts to own that and say, okay, come and showcase your work in this particular public space, which is not exactly a spontaneous expression, but yet an important expression. I think it's important to design cities and to develop public spaces which are open, which are accessible, and which can be put to multiple uses. It doesn't mean anarchy. It doesn't mean that you use it when and how and in whatever way you like it, without really looking at, intrusion, or looking at interruption of other activities, or looking at, or being offensive or disruptive in any way. That's not the point. The point is that spaces which are multi-use and spaces which are collaboratively created and collaboratively owned by communities are far more likely to bring out people in more constructive ways than in destructive ways.
Okay, but should they be at the table? Joy, what do you think?
I think there's also a question of context. When you look at a city like Nairobi, when you're outside of the CBD is formal. The CBD really is an expression of local government power. But the informal, the outer areas, you find that people create signage. They advertise hairdressing by drawing something on the wall, styles of hair, or by drawing products that you can buy in that particular store. And therefore, there is a customization to seeing things drawn on the wall. And what's interesting is that in one of the neighborhoods of Nairobi, called Jericho, there has actually been a demand by some of the residents from graffiti artists to beautify their walls with graffiti in the homes. It's not seen as something that is defacing. It's actually seen as something that is enhancing. And so I think the context is also important. What is the practice and what is the exposure of people to things on the wall and to murals? And in certain parts of Nairobi, you'll find that is something that is actually desired. But certainly in the city center, when you put that up, yes, City Hall will come and paint that off. Yeah.
So one person's art is another's vandalism? I don't know. Any other questions?
I would like to...
Oh, sorry, Mayor.
Sorry. I would like to donate this to that gentleman. There's an opportunity which artists that you referred to have of displaying or showcasing their talents at the National Gallery. You can have it.
Yeah, you're welcome. We have another question here. Yes, thank you. Thank you,
This is
Mayor.
Muhammad Yassin from University of Udine in Italy. In the presentation, the expectation, the future projection of the population growth in Africa, maybe you foresee an urban sprawl and most probably formation of new informal settlements around the major urban settings in Africa. Do you think that the African municipalities have their master plans so they can avoid the shortcomings of the current informal settings in Africa? And how do you see also in the municipalities in the informal settings now currently prevailing in Africa, the issue of the waste no, the urban waste or the solid waste. Because I noticed that in the CBD in Nairobi it is managed, while when you go to our outskirts, then there is a disaster. So all the people there are vulnerable to high risk of health and so on. Thank you.
Who would like to take that? Shipra?
Yeah, I'd like to take particularly the first part of your question on the role of master planning in addressing the challenges. I'm actually, with all due respect to the mayor who said it's all about discipline and good master planning, I actually think that rigid master plans, old-fashioned rigid master plans, have done more of a disservice to cities than a service to cities in the developing world particularly. Because we followed a very strong tradition, a strong sort of colonial tradition as well, of different of standards that just don't apply to our cities. Master planning can be quite rigid. Master planning takes a long time. It's an expensive process and usually not adequately participatory or responsive to the people. So many cities are shifting to more flexible, action-oriented strategic plans, and that's something that African cities also need to look at. And the other thing that I think they need to look at is not just cities, but I think African countries need to look at something like an overarching national urban policy. Without a broad view of where urbanization is progressing, where urban development needs to happen, which are going to be the hubs, how are you going to distribute urban development across the country, without that, you're really not going to find a solution to the urbanization challenge in African cities and countries.
Carlos, how do you see that?
Well, I agree. I think master plans have to be planned, formulated. Cities must have a common north, a clear common north, but flexibility, I agree, is very important because we are planning cities which already exist. I mean, you cannot erase and do them again. So you have to work with people, understand. There was some examples, very important examples, when we went into those territories, we talked with people because we had an idea of the whole of the city, but they knew which was, several places were extremely important for them, where things happened.
How did you hear them? Was it a public hearing? Was it a workshop? How was it structured?
We did workshops with children, with leaders, different workshops, with women, with students, and they draw, they talk, they sing. And there we learned from what there was important for them about those boroughs.
Matilda?
So this with urbanization, we at Ericsson, we are part of a project called Millennium Villages, where we provided telecom equipment to 500,000 people in 11 countries. And in these rural villages with telecommunication, they have now been able to increase their own income. They have access to education. They can live lives there, and they don't have to be pushed to the cities, which is also, I think, is important regarding urbanization, and you addressed it. What is happening in the other parts of the country as such, and how do we integrate that when we discuss urbanization as such? So there is one example of how technology can help to have a meaningful and a vibrant city in the villages.
Very quickly, Carlos, we only have 10 minutes left, and we got a few more questions. Go ahead.
There is a good example. There was a place with a river behind in the hills, which had two bands of young people fighting with arms, one's to the other, and we built a bridge. But first, we started talking with them and putting them together and making agreements. So finally, that became a very beautiful place where children play right now. So that's, planning has to understand what happens in territories.
Okay, very good. Sir?
Hello, my name is Adan Aguilar. I come from Mexico. I'm a student of human rights. And I'm very interested in what you're saying about planning for open society or planning for different groups. Nowadays, cities are multicultural. So I was thinking, Shipra, you were telling about public spaces also this sense of belongingness. How do you address this, but for multicultural societies, not only for a specific group or a specific community, but also like belongingness, but for different groups.
Okay, who'd like to take that? Mayor.
I needed to respond partially to his question and then maybe later to the point that he's just raised. You know, planning is not just done for the hell of it, if I can put it that way. You know, the bottom line is that what you can't measure, you can't even begin to address, you know, as a problem. Many of you will recall that in 2008, Harare or Zimbabwe experienced a cholera outbreak, which took the lives of 4,000 people, the majority of whom were in Harare. And that came about as a direct result of lack of planning over time. Because if you don't deal with these things incrementally, as the city, the country's population increases, you're left with a problem where the pressure becomes unbearable. Then you have Joy and Shifra and yourself saying the city is not doing enough to accommodate the burgeoning population. So we need to plan and make sure that people don't put up structures haphazardly on wetlands and all over the place, because we need to service the Stearns in terms of providing water and sanitation before we put up the structures. And there's a cost to all that. And all these things can be done provided we put our heads together and list the services of the private sector and various NGOs which are more than prepared to come to the party. Because you cannot allow structures to be put up and then seek to address the problem, the issue of providing those critically needed services when the structures are up. It just doesn't work. You're putting the proverbial cart before the horse.
Yes, Joy.
But just to make a comment more specifically to your question around multiculturalism, I mean, one of the things that the festival that we did was premised on was the fact that the city is diverse. And the first thing that we need to recognize and appreciate is that diversity. There might be some fundamental things that we all need that are common to all of us. We need water, we need roads that work, we need sanitation that works. But beyond that, there's actually a sense of culture that is different within the neighborhoods. And so one of the things that we were asking those neighborhoods to actually not shy away from was that diversity, that thing that made them distinctive, because ultimately that is what also enriches a city. So I'm not a planner, but I would say that I think that is one of the things that planners need to look at, that beyond the basic infrastructure, there is also diversity that enriches a city and that allows people to be who they are as well.
Okay, yes, Shifra.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think that's critical. Recognizing diversity, engaging with diversity, but essentially, what is the characteristic of a good public space? Okay. What are the characteristics of a good public space? I'd say two key characteristics. One, accessibility to all, and second, safety. Two key characteristics that make a public space a good public space. I mean, there's other dimensions. There's, you know, it needs to be nicely developed, creative, whatever. And my point is that basically clean, safe, accessible public spaces which are collaboratively developed, which are creatively used, which allow use by different groups, and which are places of encounter and places of learning and places of appreciation of the other, can contribute really to reducing conflict, to greater social cohesion in multicultural societies. They have a very, very important role, and that's central.
Good. That sounds like what we would put in the post-2015 planning, right?
I can give you the text.
Okay, very good. What I'd like to do is throw this question out, the other question, the multiple question, because this one asks you to give a word. Can we have a vote on the other one? Just a hand vote. What you think after you've heard this discussion today? Can you give me the other question, Frédéric? Give me the other one. How big a role should artists and cultural organizations play in urban planning? That's the bottom line of this conversation. How much are we going to listen to them in planning post-2015? Should they have a deciding role? How many think they should have a deciding role? Nobody. Not many. Okay? Okay? Should they have an influential role? Okay? And a consultative role. We listen to them. So that's interesting. An influential role. So they should be at the table, but they don't make the decision. The buck stops here. Right. Very interesting. Why don't we have a sum up with Thomas? Thomas Melin, who's head of the Office of External Relations, UN Habitat. You live in Nairobi. Established the Sustainable Urban Development Network, SUDNet. You're a construction coordinator for Swedish Save the Children in Ethiopia. That was a long time ago, right? But that shows you how much you were involved on the ground in development. Thomas, what's your takeaway from this evening?
I think that we planned this event, UN Habitat, together with Beaux-Arts and the EU on culture and art, how important it is in order to make sustainable cities. And listening here today, I feel that this has been proven over again. A sustainable city has to be planned, it has to be managed in a way so that the citizens are participating, that they are visible. And we are in an area, in a time where there is a tremendous change. We saw the figures on the screen. Urbanization has always been going on, but now suddenly it's exploding in time. We need sustainable cities. We need new types of cities. And that's what we are discussing. How can we do them differently? Everyone is talking about the post-15. Now, the post-15 is a new era. It is not going to be a little more of what we had before. And I can tell you, it's going to be urban. It is already urban, but it's still exploding. We need a new approach to cities.
Before it's too late, right?
We need a new approach to cities to avoid all these kind of negative aspects that we can also see from cities.
That we're already seeing in some cases.
A good city is a help to society, but an ill-planned city create problems. This is extremely important to find new ways, and this way to start to connect different types of thinking, different types of the society. A multi-sectorial approach to cities is the only way that's going to make this work. That's why we did put all these fantastic people here to actually explain.
And do you agree with the audience that it should be an influential and not a decision-making role of these
This
groups?
session we have talked about some of the groups in society. I think that every group in society must be able to get the chance to be part of planning of their environment, because if they don't, the city will not work.
So you like the workshop idea that Carlos had, for instance?
We, UN Habitat, is actually putting on an enormous big event in Medellin next year, the World Urban Forum, just because we like so much what they have done.
And Joy, how do you, when you hear what Thomas says, how can your organization, organizations like yours, contribute to that?
I think we've shown that already. I think we've shown that there can be lateral ways of engaging participation and getting useful information for all of the city around how to move forward.
And how do you get the private sector in this? Matilda?
We also engage in different ways, as I said, regarding how technology can help with the purposes, but also to help the artists to reach out.
Very good. Mayor, is Thomas on the moon, or what do you think?
I think what Thomas says is eminently sensible, but at the end of the day, as I keep harping, there's a cost to these things. So during the 5 years and a bit that I served as mayor, I had an open doors policy. I factored in all the representations made by the various stakeholders, but at the end of the day, the buck stopped with me. I had to move the thing forward.
Shipra, how do you deal with cost?
Well, you need to engage different stakeholder groups to start contributing and to start really owning the process and to start putting their money where their mouth is.
Very good. Thomas, a final word?
there is the post-15 debate which is ongoing. We all can participate in this debate. We can participate as the organizations we come from, or the individuals that we are, or maybe from the cities where we come, but we have to participate because it's the world's future. And we have to secure that urban issues and art and culture issues gets into the post-15 debate. Otherwise, we have failed.
Thomas Melin, Head Office External Relations, UN Habitat, thank you very much. Thanks also to the panel, a very interesting panel. If you have other questions to them after this, please let us know. And I think that's about it for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. Our thanks, of course, to the United Nations, to the European Commission, and to Beaux-Arts. Thank you very much, and good night.